All right, we're surprisingly on time. We're actually going to be a little bit early after running a little late this morning. Alicia Charles went a little long this morning, which Charles Chamberlain did, not surprisingly.
Well, I saw the talk. It was a great talk.
So it was a great talk. It was a great overview. Actually, Charles was after you as a historian at the Louisiana State Museum.
We worked together for some period of time. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So Alicia is a professor of history at LSU in Baton Rouge. She spoke a couple years ago at our Storyville Symposium on her book, The Great Southern Babylon: Sex, Race, and Respectability in New Orleans. She is a great speaker on these topics, as well as she's going to have here the state of Louisiana versus Clay L. Shaw, New Orleans, homophobia, and one district attorney's attempt to solve the Kennedy assassination. So we're going to get into a little bit of continue on a little bit with what's going on in New Orleans at that time. And with that, I give it to Alicia. Thank you so much for speaking.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks everybody for hanging in there this afternoon. I did see Charles's talk this morning and caught Charlene's and also Craig's, and I missed a couple, but I'm very glad I was here for the last part of the last talk. So the Hale-Boggs conspiracy theorizing fits a little bit into what I'm going to talk about today, and we can certainly talk about some of those things more in the Q&A as you guys wish to. But I'm going to talk about a case called State of Louisiana versus Clay L. Shaw. And the subtitle is very descriptive of where we're going to go over the next little bit together. New Orleans, homophobia, and one district attorney's attempt to solve the Kennedy assassination. Now, most of you are aware that there is a no small number of books dedicated to answering questions about the Kennedy assassination. Gerald Posner, more than 20 years ago, suggested that there were probably more than 2,000. And with that as sort of the background and the sort of sense that most of those books argue for a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. And most of those conspiracy books tend to argue for very complex conspiracies that often involve dozens of actors who encouraged, planned, participated in, or sought to cover up the events that took place in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. So with that kind of sprawling literature as the context for writing and thinking about the Kennedy assassination, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that only one person was ever tried in a court of law accused of participating in a conspiracy that led to John F. Kennedy's assassination. And that person is Clay Laverne Shaw, born in Kentwood or just outside Kentwood. So he's a Louisiana native but spent most of his adulthood in New Orleans. This is a photo of him being perp walked from the district attorney's office at Tulane and Broad. He was taken through a sort of intentionally gathered group of reporters with his hands rather gratuitously cuffed to the front. And they timed the arrest after all these reporters had gathered. So this image and his perp walk became national news almost immediately. And so this is a very familiar photograph to anyone who knows about these events and about Clay Shaw's experience as the only person ever tried in one of the thousands of conspiracies alleged in the Kennedy assassination. So this is Shaw, and he's an important part of what we're going to talk about today. The other person who is an important part of what we're going to talk about today is Jim Garrison, who was district attorney of Orleans Parish from 1962 to 1973. So he won 3 terms. He ran for a 4th term and was defeated by Harry Connick Sr. So he served 3 terms, and then later he is elected to a judgeship in Louisiana. So this is an image taken about a week before Clay Shaw was arrested. I think the date on it is February 24th. And by this time, Garrison had made some very definitive claims about his investigation into the Kennedy assassination. In fact, he told reporters from all over the world who had come to the city that he had solved the Kennedy assassination and that there would be arrests to follow and that there would be convictions to follow, and that they had absolutely resolved the open issues related to the Kennedy assassination. And we'll talk a little bit about the background of his investigation, sort of my own analysis of its basis in fact. But it's just important to kind of see the two main protagonists of what we're going to talk about today, and also really the main protagonists of my book. And like Charles did and some other people have done today, I'm going to start by just making some suggestions about books that you might want to look at if you are interested in Garrison's investigation into the Kennedy assassination and Clay Shaw's prosecution. And there's a sort of school of books about the Garrison investigation that argue in a very kind of simplified way, Garrison was right and there was a conspiracy and Garrison was onto it. And if you are interested in this question, you may have already read these books. But if you read these books, namely Jim Garrison's On the Trail of the Assassins, which was published in 1987, you're going to get a look into sort of his thinking about the investigation that he undertook and why, and I'm going to apologize for the dogs and they will stop, but I live alone and I can't make them stop. So let's just keep moving like it's not happening. Okay. And then Destiny Betrayed by Jim DiEugenio and Let Justice Be Done by William Davey are both books that also argue quite stridently that Jim Garrison was right and that Clay Shaw was involved in a conspiracy. So if that's, it's sort of where you want to enter this literature, this is where you would enter, right? If you are sort of the opposite school of thinking about these questions, you probably want to look at one of these books. And I've, sort of curated these out of dozens of books, but Garrison was wrong, Shaw was a victim is sort of the central argument of these three books, right? So American Grotesque by James Kirkwood provides a very deep account of Clay Shaw's trial in the sort of months leading up to it. It's long, it's very detailed, but it's a good resource because Kirkwood did a lot of interviews with some of the principals to the trial itself, and a lot of that material is appended in the back of the book. So it's actually kind of a valuable historical source of its own. Pat Lambert's False Witness, the real story of Jim Garrison's investigation, and Oliver Stone's film JFK came out in the wake of the Oliver Stone movie and attempted to sort of right what she felt like were a plethora of historical wrongs that were portrayed in Stone's film. And then a very recently published book, On the Trail of Delusion, Jim Garrison, The Great Accuser by Fred Litwin. I think it's an excellent book. I have taught with his other book, which is called I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak. And if I'm going to recommend any one of these books, I think it's Litwin's because it's the most up to date. It was published just months ago. But those are sort of broad polls of the material that you would end up looking at if you were looking at what is currently published about the Garrison investigation and really about the Kennedy assassination. I mean, I think, in other words, most books about the Kennedy assassination tend to be very deeply researched, but almost all of them still argue the same point, right? Was Lee Harvey Oswald the lone gunman, or was there a conspiracy? And those are sort of the two poles of the debate that people have been arguing about for 57 years, right? And so in my forthcoming book called Cruising for Conspirators, New Orleans, Homophobia, and One District Attorney's Attempt to Solve the Kennedy Assassination, I try to do something different. And I was hoping I would have cover art to share with you today, but the book is in process now. We're in copy editing. I don't have it to share, and I'm sorry about that. But the book will be out in September, I think, of 2021. Should be pre-order available by April or so. So we're in the process now, and I'm excited to talk to you all today because this is the first time I've had a chance to talk to a group of people since the book is actually sort of in the can and on the way to being produced. And so I'm going to read just a short excerpt here. I don't want to read for most of what I'm going to talk about today, but I want to explain what I think my book does differently than all these other books, right? Because most of those books focus on that very narrow binary question, lone gunman or conspiracy. And most people are trying to get to the bottom of that question. And that is a critically important question, but it has been adjudicated over and over and over again. And I wanted to do something different. And so what I do is move sexuality to the main focus of the book. And I explain in the book and show with a plethora of evidence how widespread beliefs about the criminality of homosexual men laid the foundation for Shaw's identification as a suspect, and once he was outed, helped to shape his prosecution, both culturally and in court, okay? And I think that perspective makes clear that Garrison's prosecution of Shaw was birthed in a preoccupation with homosexuality. And it helps to explain why, shortly after Shaw's arrest, Garrison described the assassination conspiracy he alleged as a homosexual thrill killing, right? Those are his words spoken to a journalist named James Phelan, who subsequently published this article in June of 1967 in the Saturday Evening Post. And if you can, I don't know how closely your screens, what the resolution is, but you can see the three conspirators he alleged were involved in the New Orleans aspects of the conspiracy were a man named David Ferry. I'll talk more about him in a minute. Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald, who is at the bottom of the page. And you can see in the little text box between that he also says something to Phelan to the effect that there was the thrill of staging the perfect crime. Remember the Loeb and Leopold case of 1924? It was the same thing. And of course, Nathan Loeb and Richard Leopold were two young men, late teens, early 20s, who tried to commit the perfect murder. And they were very smart guys, but they were very lousy assassins. And they were caught almost immediately and tried and went to prison. And one of the big spectacular things about that case is that those two boys were sexually involved with each other, right? And so by comparing the conspiracy Garrison has claim to uncover to the Loeb and Leopold case would have had a lot of cultural resonance for people, right? And so I'm just kind of close with the reading part of this by saying Garrison's use of Shaw's sexuality as an investigative and prosecutorial tool undergirded the conspiratorial terroir he cultivated in New Orleans. And then those ideas sort of served as a subterranean root system that shaped the work of subsequent authors and auteurs like Oliver Stone, and fueled popular belief in an assassination conspiracy. The related belief, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, that homosexuals were clannish, secretive, interconnected, and liable to commit all manner of crimes, up to and including murder, is a critical factor to consider when assessing events in New Orleans in the late 1960s. Right, so this sort of presumed link between homosexuality and deviant criminality has a very long half-life, right? And these ideas are laid out in a very long medical textbook by a sexologist named Richard von Krafft-Ebing in a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which was first published in 1896. I might be a little off on that date, but his book is written in a sort of style that it's used to teach not just people getting an MD, but people who want to work in the emerging fields of psychiatry or psychology. And so it's not really intended for the public. In fact, it's written in such a way that it sort of discourages public use. But it is so graphic in the sort of different sorts of sex acts it describes and the sort of links it makes between those and potential criminality that a lot of people learn about this book and sort of use it to understand themselves and their emerging kind of sexual desires. Clay Shaw references this book in a letter in 1935 when he's still in his 20s, right, to another homosexual man. And so they're talking about certain sex practices in the letter. And these ideas that come out of Krafft-Ebing and get really popularized by the 1930s have kind of contributed to a set of ideas that associate deviant sexuality generally, and I would say homosexuality specifically, with criminality, and sort of leads to the emergence of an idea of the sexual psychopath, right? A person who is liable to commit all kinds of crimes, up to and including murder, but his sort of reasons for doing those things are related to his deviant sexuality, right? And this is a very common idea in the 1930s, and lots of crimes that were not committed by gay men, they're sort of looked at as the first suspects, right? Because of this sort of cultural set of ideas. And J. Edgar Hoover, never wishing to miss an opportunity to expand his own power, began to keep records through the FBI on sex deviants in 1937. And they built a sprawling library of records related to Americans who, for some reason or the other, the FBI suspected or received information that they had sort of a deviant sexuality. in part because of this FBI set of records, but also because of other ideas related to the Cold War and the Red Scare. This also led to sort of kind of blending of ideas about being a communist, but also maybe being a homosexual. And alongside sort of the purge and search for communists in government, there's also a purge of homosexual employees at the federal level. The historian David Johnson calls this the Lavender Scare. To go alongside the Red Scare, and hundreds of people and then thousands of people lose their jobs at the federal level, and they are investigated at the time of employment. And if they are arrested for cruising or any kind of other similar activity, this will become a part of their record and can lead to job loss at the federal level. And we also need to remember that the American Psychological Association, the APA, classed homosexuality as a mental illness until 1973, right? So those are very durable cultural ideas. They sort of swim around in the ether of the way people think about things. And those ideas are powerful and important in trying to understand what happened in New Orleans in those years. And we tend, I think sometimes, because New Orleans is considered a gay-friendly town now, we tend to think of the city as gay-friendly and presume that that was always the case. It certainly was not the case. New Orleans and New Orleanians were not immune to those sorts of beliefs. And in the aftermath of World War II, people who we now recognize as gay began to become more visible, particularly in the French Quarter neighborhood. And when reformers got together and were empowered to look at particular social problems in New Orleans, they very often sort of moved to other preoccupations of their own. And so in 1950, there's a group put together called the Citizens Special Committee for the Vieux Carré. And this man, Richard Foster, was put in charge of that committee. Now, its origins had nothing to do with the quote unquote problem of homosexuals in the French Quarter, but he is very preoccupied with this issue. And this comes from a letter that he wrote, a police official. Criminologists and psychologists in America argue that every sexual deviant is a potential murderer. And the more of this type we can drive out of New Orleans, the better the city will be, right? And this is just one kind of piece of evidence for this attitude in New Orleans in the 1950s. And the 1950s is really a decade that is quite unfriendly to people who are visibly homosexual. People we would identify today as LGBT or queer, right? And in fact, by the end of the decade, the Commission Council of the City of New Orleans appointed a chairman to run a committee. He was actually Delaceps Morrison's half-brother. And he ran a committee called the Committee on the Problem of Sex Deviants in New Orleans. And while it purports to talk about the city at large, it is really focused again on the French Quarter. And it was put together to study, quote, the acute problems caused by sex deviants in New Orleans. So I have a couple of articles about the era of the 1950s, and I'd be happy to share them with anybody who wants to take a look at them. They're in sort of academic edited publications, so they can be hard to run down. But if you email me at LSU, I'd be happy to find copies and send them your way. So the point is, from the early 50s to the late 50s, there's a sort of preoccupation among many reformers with homosexuals and the dangers they purportedly present to people in the city. So by 1960, there were city ordinances and state laws that criminalized the following: hiring known homosexuals, renting a property to known homosexuals, allowing homosexuals to tend a bar, gathering in places where known homosexuals congregated. And by 1963, arrests for crimes classed as homosexual exceeded those in any other NOPD crime categories. And you can go look at the annual reports for the NOPD, and the Vice Commission, or excuse me, the Vice Squad in particular, chalks up a lot of arrests because they tend to cruise men's rooms in and around the French Quarter that are known as cruising spots. And they go in and, essentially entrap people and arrest them. And by the mid-1960s, there are hundreds of these arrests every year. Most of them do not result in prosecution or prison time, although they could. But what does happen in many cases is that your name and address were printed in the newspaper, and then these cultural attitudes could lead to family being isolated from your family or losing your job. So this is sort of the landscape, right? Around the time that Jim Garrison first becomes district attorney of Orleans Parish, and at the time of the Kennedy assassination, right? And almost all of us know that JFK was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. This is him with Jackie O and the Connollys in the open top convertible just shortly before the shooting occurs. Very famous American photo, as are a lot of photos of that particular day. And within an hour and a half of the shooting of Kennedy, this person, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been taken into custody by the Dallas police. And I'm going to keep this part real brief. We can talk about it more in the Q&A if you want to. But Oswald worked at the Texas School Book Depository. He is identified as a suspect in the killing of a Dallas police officer named J.D. Tippit. And he's picked up on that charge, essentially, and brought to Dallas Police Headquarters. And about 30 minutes after Oswald arrives at Dallas Police Headquarters, Police Chief Jesse Curry comes in and says he wants a search warrant to go pick up Oswald at his rooming house, because when they did a sort of roll call of all the employees at the Texas School Book Depository, Oswald was the only one not present, right? And so they don't have to get the search warrant and go to his rooming house because Oswald is sitting right there. For our purposes, and a really important point is that he was a New Orleans native. He was born in New Orleans, spent his very earliest years in the city, then part of his adolescence. And key to people who argue that there was a New Orleans-based conspiracy, he spent a little more than 6 months in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. And so questions about whether or not a conspiracy had been hatched in New Orleans really become a matter of interest because of his presence in the city for those months immediately before Kennedy was killed. Whatever Lee Harvey Oswald might have told police or FBI agents or Secret Service agents or the numerous people who questioned him in the 48 hours between the time he was taken into custody by the Dallas police and Jack Ruby shooting him on the morning of November 24, 1963, whatever he might have told or said about his actions forever goes into the historical ether as well, because he is killed that morning by a volatile Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. And in the immediate aftermath of Kennedy's killing, there are immediately questions about conspiracy. This is a very scary prospect to people. Was this the Russians? Was it Castro and the Cubans? Not too long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's lots of worry about are there other assassinations coming? This was very unsteady moment in the culture, and Oswald's or Ruby's shooting of Oswald on live television only kind of exacerbated the uncertainty surrounding these questions. And Lyndon B. Johnson, who by default became president as Kennedy's vice president as soon as the president died, was very concerned about these rumors. And he and others really believed that this kind of conspiratorial thinking needed to be shut down. Now, people had different reasons for wanting that to be the case, but about 10 days after the assassination, Johnson appoints Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court at the time, and a group of other men from the Congress, the Senate, and a couple of other the former director of the CIA and a former ambassador were also members. All those names are escaping me at the moment, but Hale Boggs was, of course, one of the people on the Warren Commission. And the report from the Warren Commission was issued just about 10 months after the assassination itself, and before the November 1964 election, in which Johnson would run for his own term as president. And this is a sprawling report. It has more than 24 volumes that go along with the main report itself. The main report runs under just 900 pages. But the real nut of what the Warren report concluded is that Oswald was the lone gunman, that Ruby also acted alone, and that there was no evidence of a foreign or domestic conspiracy that had been discovered up to the point that this report was completed. Okay. And there is a sort of bounce in public opinion for this conclusion in the months immediately following the issuing of the report. But like a lot of very detailed government reports, what this report also provides is an enormous amount of fodder for people who don't believe the report, don't agree with analytical calls that the commission and commissioners made. And so people start to use the other volumes of the Warren Commission report to write critiques of the lone gunman and no conspiracy conclusions of that report. So what about what we're talking about today, what I'm trying to talk about here, which is that the issue of homosexuality in the Warren report? Well, it is clear that dozens of witnesses, based on their affidavits or testimony, were queried about Oswald and Ruby's sexuality, right? And I think this is very important that these questions were being asked at all, and they are answered in a section of the core report relating to questions of whether or not there was a conspiracy. Also kind of interesting that it's located there. And the commission concludes very directly, but quite briefly, that the commission has investigated rumors that Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald were both homosexuals and thus might have known each other in that respect. However, no evidence has been uncovered to support the rumors. The closest acquaintances of both men emphatically deny them, and Ruby's nightclubs were not known to have been frequented by homosexuals. So there is a fair amount of material sort of lurking in different corners of the report related to the potential homosexuality of these men. And I think that's an important point in thinking through the larger issues that we're talking about today. So where does the New Orleans investigation come? Well, these two men, like hundreds, if not thousands of other Americans, felt like they knew something that law enforcement or the FBI or the Secret Service ought to know about a potential assassination conspiracy in the hours and days immediately following the assassination. And both these men, Jack S. Martin and Dean Adams Andrews, told stories to law enforcement officials that they suggested could tell those officials something important about the assassination and people that they ought to look into, right? Who had associated with Oswald, particularly in those last 6 months he was in New Orleans. So this slide is a little hairy, but just hang in there with me, if you will. Jack Martin, who was originally born, his name at birth was Edward Stewart Suggs, and he had a extensive criminal record and moves to New Orleans in the late 1950s, and almost immediately thereafter checks himself into the mental ward of Charity Hospital. And after he comes out of the mental ward in Charity Hospital, he changes his name to Jack S. Martin. And so Martin has a crazy assassination weekend. But one of the things he does is call local police. He calls investigators for the district attorney's office, and ultimately he will call the FBI and the Secret Service. And he will tell them that he thinks it's possible that Lee Harvey Oswald had known a person named David Ferry, who Jack Martin hated. These two men hated each other. And he thought that they might have known each other through something called the Civil Air Patrol, which Oswald was briefly involved in, and Ferry was a instructor for the Civil Air Patrol. So he tells these investigators that he thinks it's possible that Ferry had not only taught Oswald to use a rifle with a scope, but that the two of them might have been sexually involved, and that it was also possible that Ferry had hypnotized Oswald and sort of given him post-hypnotic suggestion to leave New Orleans, go to Dallas, and kill the president of the United States. Okay, this is the story Jack Martin tells. Dean Adams Andrews tells a different story over the course of the assassination weekend, when he is in a hospital being administered narcotics, including phenobarbital and narcotic cough suppressants. And he calls the FBI, who will ultimately call the Secret Service. He calls a local television station, and he wants to make a statement about what he knows. And what he suggests is that Lee Harvey Oswald had come into his law office several times that summer that he was in the city. And these are his descriptions, that he was accompanied by as many as 5 different men, what he called 3 gay kids, a Texas-born Mexican, which that's his locution. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but I think he's talking about a Spanish speaker, and a man named Clay Bertrand. And ultimately, Andrews will provide authorities 3 separate physical descriptions of Clay Bertrand, but he is never able to sort of point them to where Clay Bertrand might be. So the Warren Commission almost completely, after several interviews with Martin, discount what he has to say. Andrews is interviewed further by the Warren Commission. He is mentioned in 1 sentence of a chapter in the Warren Commission. And the Warren Commission basically discounts Andrews' story too, although they do mention him. So after the Warren Commission report comes out, there are a couple of important bestsellers that are written during that period of time, and lots of people get interested in these questions. And one of those people is Jim Garrison, right? And what Jim Garrison has that none of the other Warren Commission investigators have is subpoena power, right? He has legal authority. He can take his doubts about the Warren Commission, and he can, if he can find suspects to arrest and charge and indict and prosecute, he could be the person who sort of brings this thing into a courtroom and answers all the lingering questions related to these issues. But as much as Garrison is sort of treated in much of the literature as sort of an innovator in this field, he starts with those same stories, right, that Jack Martin and Dean Andrews had told about Lee Harvey Oswald and homosexuality. And what he does, and this is important, what he does over time is take these 2 stories that arose independently, right? And he kind of merges those stories and sort of massages those stories in a way so that you get a novel trio of conspirators, right? And that novel trio of conspirators were Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferrie, and the elusive Clay Bertrand, right? And these become the sort of kind of conspiratorial trio that he goes to court on, right? But that's where that group of suspects comes from. And despite all the other kind of roads that Garrison will go down and theories that he promulgates, this is the foundation of that conspiratorial trio. Garrison also was a very serious press hound, right? He liked publicity. He liked it long before the Kennedy assassination or his investigation began. He liked talking with reporters. He liked newspaper stories being written about him. He liked to be in the media. And I've written a short article about this called the Garrison Tactics, which can be found on the 64 Parishes website through the LEH. And you can read it and judge for yourself, because I talk about his longer term use of the media, what is really very skillful use of the media. He was very good on television, which sort of underwrote his popularity in his original election. So he is willing to make deals with reporters all through his career to sort of advance whatever narrative he has going at a given moment. And with regard to the Kennedy assassination investigation, he makes a deal with Life magazine. And the parameters, the basic parameters of the deal are that he will let Life sort of record aspects of the investigation as it's ongoing. And what Life will do, besides probably do a story, is that they will help with resources of their own, because they have reporters and photographers all across the country, and they can have people sort of help with the investigation where Garrison's small staff might need assistance. But what they are also doing is that they are photographing people when they are being questioned. And here is an image of a Life photographer photographing. I don't know if it's Clay Shaw he is photographing, but I think it's the very same room. You can see the teletype in both of those images. But that seems like an ethical problem to me. And Patricia Lambert certainly sort of argues this is an ethical problem to have like reporters covering the inside of this investigation being done on private citizens. In this case, we're just going to talk about Clay Shaw. In this case, someone who had not been arrested or charged with anything at this time, but it's sort of his interview is being documented by a magazine. And the other part of Garrison's deal with Life means that when Shaw's apartment in the French Quarter is searched, at the time he's being sort of arrested and booked and moved through the process at Tulane and Broad, Garrison is able to get a search warrant approved, and he and a small group of his investigators go to Clay Shaw's home. Two of Clay Shaw's attorneys go and try to sort of control the search and make sure that there's an inventory of what's taken from the property, and they are threatened with arrest. There are lots of TD cameras outside trying to record what's going on in this sort of emerging story about an arrest. And sort of the idea that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, and that as Clay Bertrand, he had conspired with Oswald and David Ferry. And so these are images, and there are a large number of these images by a Life magazine photographer of Clay Shaw's home being searched, right? And that also seems to me ethically questionable for law enforcement to be allowing this to go on in the midst of such a high profile, allegedly important case. But nonetheless, I'll just leave this here for a second. They take something like a dozen boxes of material from Shaw's home. And even months later, they had not carefully cataloged all that material. And we know that because Clay Shaw's lawyers kept trying to get an inventory of what had been taken from his home. But shortly after they search his home, Garrison's office, or Garrison, sort of helpfully curate a list of things that were seized from Clay Shaw's home. And that list is put together in such a way to sort of suggest that not just that Clay Shaw was a homosexual, but that he was a particularly depraved homosexual, a person into BDSM. And so whips and chains and robes are sort of some of the first things that are listed in that curated list that is then sort of distributed to media outlets all over the country and printed. And I think very troublingly, some of that evidence is then transported to Garrison's semi-suburban home, where he and Photographers for Life magazine stage a sort of very odd photo shoot with Clay Shaw's seized property. And Garrison was a very smart guy, and he had a really he had a great command of words. He was very convincing and charismatic to people, but it seems to me he made some very bad judgments in cases of this type, letting what is evidence in such an important case be transported. So, breaking chain of custody. This goes to his home, where it's photographed for a potential story in Life magazine. And these are dynamite photographs. I mean, as historical evidence, but I think they're also quite troubling evidence of how and for what reasons this investigation is on the track it's on at this particular moment that Clay Shaw is arrested in March 1, 1967. And besides this, Clay Shaw's property was then taken to a psychiatrist, a very well-known psychiatrist at Tulane University at that time, named Dr. Robert Heath. And so the same BDSM material is taken to Heath, and this is a memorandum that is available, I believe, on the internet, if I'm not mistaken, now through the National Archives and Jim Garrison's investigative papers. And he just says, basically, I brought various pieces of evidence in the Clay Shaw matter to Dr. Robert Heath at Tulane University. After he examined it, I had an interview, at which time he told me that Shaw's motive, as you suggested, could very possibly have been rooted, in his sadistic homosexual abnormality, right? So this very long sort of cultural set of ideas that I sketched out in the very beginning are playing a role in Garrison's investigation. And there is plenty of evidence for this, all right? This is a magazine story that appeared in August of 1968. It appeared just a few months before Shaw goes on trial in January of 1969 in Confidential magazine, not the most high-toned magazine in the whole wide world, but they feature in this issue a special report on the homosexual ring that killed Kennedy, revealed by a confidential reporter. And that reporter, Joel Palmer, was actually a sort of quasi-investigator working on the edges of the Garrison investigation, right? So there is a link between the investigation and this article that has been demonstrated by Fred Litwin in his new book. So he shared this information with me, and I'm sharing it with you. And this is sort of the inside jacket of the story, wherein Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, and David Ferry are homosexuals number 1, 2, and 3. And homosexual number 4 is Clay Bertrand Shaw, right? This figure who Dean Adams Andrews identified as being an associate of Oswald's in the summer of 1963. By this time, an assumption has been made that he was in fact Clay Bertrand, and it's on this basis that the conspiracy argument will be made. And there is one eyewitness who attests to seeing these 3 men conspire. Okay, and we can talk about some of that if we need to, or you want to, in the Q&A. So Clay Shaw goes on trial in January of 1969. The first testimony is taken in early February because it takes them more than 2 weeks to seat a jury, right? They end up calling more than 1,200 jurors to the stand to try to find 12 people, well, 14, because they needed 2 alternates who said they didn't have a fixed opinion about whether or not there was a conspiracy in the assassinations, and if they could give Shaw a fair trial. So the voir dire is part of what took so long in this case. And I have a chapter in the forthcoming book where I talk about how there is a subtext related to homosexuality and its kind of monstrosity that moves very subtly throughout the trial. But the upshot here is that Shaw, 2 years to the day after he was arrested, was found not guilty by a unanimous jury verdict, and they deliberated for under an hour in making that decision after a several-week trial. And again, these questions are still debated, and I certainly have made very definitive analytical calls about what I think happened in terms of the Garrison investigation and its focus on Clay Shaw. But I can't answer all your questions about the assassination or assassination conspiracy. And there's a sprawling literature that tries to do that. And what I've tried to do in the book is something new, I think, and innovative, and try to use that sprawling archive, sprawling being the word of the afternoon, right? Try to use that sprawling archive related to the Kennedy assassination to do something different, to sort of shift the way we think about and ask questions about it. And so we can get off that kind of circular argument that we continue to have about conspiracy or lone gunmen, and try to think about these really important events in New Orleans in the late 1960s from a fresh perspective. And so I hope I've done that, and I hope next year when the book comes out, you'll have interest and take a look at it. And I don't know how long I've gone, but I'm happy now if you just want to have some Q&A.
Yeah, we can
move in that direction. Yeah.
Or any questions? Does anybody have any questions, either in the chat or if they want to unmute themselves, they're welcome to ask them.
Yes, I do.
Oh, there, Bobby Avbaum wants to ask a question. Go ahead.
Do you have any relationship about the murder of Dr. Mary Sherman with all these events?
Well, you know, I'm aware of the book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Right. And I will say that Garrison's investigation is looking into this question. And they're looking into this question because there is an attempt within the investigation to link Shaw to at least 3 other quote unquote homosexually tinged murders that were unsolved. And Sherman's was one of those. They do not successfully do that as part of the investigation. And if you're interested in this question, you probably saw the 50th anniversary story related to Sherman's murder, where the reporters got the police reports. And what they discovered in those police reports is that one of the things that may have prohibited pursuit of a particular male subject is the idea that Sherman was a lesbian. This is not a confirmed issue, right? But that Sherman was a lesbian and that her murder was a crime of passion by a spurned lover or a disgruntled lover. And so that's that 50th anniversary article that appeared in the Picayune is really, really good. I mean, I would recommend it.
Where was it?
It was on NOLA.com, I think, or the Picayune. If you can't find it, let me know and I'll be happy to try to find the link someplace. But I don't think Clay Shaw had anything to do with Dr. Mary Sherman's murder, nor do I think he had to do with the hanging death of Jimmy Roop, who was a 15-year-old boy who died probably while masturbating under autoerotic asphyxiation. And so I don't think the evidence shows that link.
Okay, but.
I know.
Do you think Mary Sherman had a relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald and maybe even Ferry?
Um,
I mean, do you think?
I don't know. I know there is sort of, one witness who, and I know her. Her name is Victoria Powell Lovejoy Sulzer. She's a lovely woman,
Mhm.
and she lived in the patio apartments where Mary Sherman lived, and a guy named Juan Valdez was also her neighbor. And she says that Lee Harvey Oswald came to her door in the summer of 1963, and she thinks that he probably knew Juan Valdez, and that somehow this is suggests a connection
Right.
to the assassination or Mary Sherman's murder. That is a very tragic and very gruesome murder, but
Right.
I do not find the material I don't, as a historian, for me, analytically, that book doesn't hang together in a convincing way
Well-
out of the documentary evidence. That's my opinion.
Well, I will say that I received a call from a friend who will remain nameless, who recovered from the 12th floor of Charity Hospital the autopsy pictures from Mary Sherman's death. Fascinating.
Yeah, and there are some of those photos in that newspaper story.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay.
I have a question, Alicia.
Okay.
How hard is it to write a story? I mean, a book like this when you're dealing with conspiracy theories that are like well established, not true stories, but people's minds have been made either by the movie, Oliver Stone movie, or what happened before the movie came out. How hard is that to research when this big whopper is out there?
Well, I see a couple of my friends on this meeting, and Tamara Carboni and Alan Rayfield, and they know how long this book has taken me to write. And it took me more than a decade. And sometimes I wish I never started it because it took so long. And it takes so long because the secondary record is so big. But the primary source record is also humongous. And at the National Archives alone, there are more than 5 million unique documents in the Kennedy assassination papers collection. So, and there's a very rich archive related to the Garrison investigation in repositories in and around New Orleans too. The New Orleans Public Library, HNOC, Tulane has a little bit of material. It's like, so, just getting my arms around, number one, the sort of terrain of conspiracy theorizing, and understanding that I did not want to have that fight, because plenty of people do want to have that fight. And I think the question of who killed a president is an enormously important historical question. So in saying that I don't care to engage in that argument is not to say that I don't think it's important. It's to say that I think that has been adjudicated and that book has been written 2,000 times. And I was trying to do something kind of innovative as a historian to think about it through the lens of sexuality. I hope I've done that. I also hope, my real hope for the book is that other historians will think about using those archives in different ways, because they are super rich archives about the 1960s, generally in New Orleans and other places around the nation. And there are dozens of really dynamite books to be written out of that archive. And so kind of, just kind of inside baseball as a historian, I hope that's one of the impacts of the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I kept thinking, I was like, how do you write a book when you have this whole story that all these people believe? And I look forward to when yours comes out, because that'll help me explain it even more.
Me too. I can't wait.
Bobby's got one more question.
Yes.
Another question. Since you have such a background and have done so much research, do you think Lee Harvey Oswald was pro or anti-Castro?
I think the evidentiary record is mixed, but his private papers and his behavior in that trip to Mexico City and his sort of odd sojourn in the Soviet Union suggest a kind of leftist ideological perspective. The evidence suggests a kind of leftist ideological perspective, and his private papers too. But Oswald was a young guy, and he was a malcontent. And he had been kind of violent off and on through his adolescence. And there is pretty good evidence provided by his wife, Marina Oswald Porter, who is another whole story in terms of varying testimony over time. But she suggests that in April of 1963, Oswald took a shot at General Edwin Walker in Dallas, and he missed. And that is part of the reason that he came to New Orleans in April of 1963 to get out of Dallas. So if she is telling the truth, and there is evidence in his papers that she is telling the truth, he clearly had a propensity for shooting at people. Now, Edwin Walker was a very far right individual who had been sort of drummed out of the military by Kennedy because he was essentially indoctrinating U.S. troops in John Bircher material. So, my take on the evidence is that his murder of Kennedy was almost entirely opportunistic and had to do with happenstance about where he found himself, about the personal relationship in which he was with his wife, which was a bad situation. I don't think he thought about it a long time. I just think he did it. Now, other people disagree with me, but that's my read on the evidence. And believe me, I've spent more than a decade looking at the evidence, and that's where I come down.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So you say that basically Oswald was doing the same exact thing that Garrison was doing, which was trying to make himself into some kind of bigger than life character.
Well, he had I love the Warren Report, and critics hate the Warren Report, but as a historical trove of information, the Warren Report is fascinating, and it's all digitized now, and you can search it all online, and it's amazing just to kind of go through and take a look at what's there. And he had a historic diary that he was keeping, right? That sort of provides evidence of his own inflated sense of self, right? And so, yeah, he was an oddball character. He's about the age at which, not always, but often, assassins act. They tend to be in the first half of their 20s. Not always, but often. So, he was a malcontent. He didn't fit in. But he does have some screwy things that he does in New Orleans that are hard to understand. And so I understand where people kind of come around to an intelligence angle on this. Again, lots of people have gone down that rabbit hole, and there's lots of books that you can read about it.
Jay Stanley asked a question. Why did Garrison particularly target Shaw besides his homosexuality? What evidence initially prompted him to investigate Shaw?
Okay, so they were sort of beating the bushes around the French Quarter for who this Clay Bertrand was.
Okay.
Right? And nobody could find him. The FBI had not been able to find him in 1963. Warren commissioners had not been able to find him in 1964. Garrison starts looking again in 1966. And he theorizes that they were looking for a homosexual named Clay. And Clay Shaw lived in the French Quarter. Clay Shaw spoke Spanish. And Clay Shaw was a known homosexual. And Garrison makes this identification to two separate reporters in December of 1966. And then he sort of moves off that until after David Ferrie dies. But the origin of him, that is a Garrison sort of phenomenon to identify Clay Shaw as Clay Bertrand. And it's his homosexuality, it's his French Quarter residence, and it's that he speaks Spanish. And those are sort of the foundations of Garrison's notion of Shaw as Bertrand. And what they get in the couple of days before they arrest Shaw is an eyewitness who is willing to say, after being hypnotized and administered sodium pentothal, truth serum, quote unquote, in interviews, that he is willing to say that he heard Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferrie, and Clay Bertrand conspiring. And so on the basis of this one alleged eyewitness's, I think, very iffy testimony, that is why he went ahead with the arrest.
But there was never ever any evidence that he was Clay Bertrand, that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand, other than
Perry Raymond Russo's testimony.
Okay.
There's a lot of alleged there's a lot of testimony that people offer after the arrest, right? A lot of people sort of come out of the woodwork.
Okay.
And people are interviewed in prisons and gay bars, and they're sort of, trying to find corroborating testimony. In fact, they do it with Clay Shaw's friends. They call people in and try to get them to say that, he used the alias Clay Bertrand. And ultimately, the only person who ever makes that claim in a court of law is Perry Raymond Russo.
Wow.
In an eyewitness account. There's auxiliary testimony. And again, the court record is all available online too. The transcripts, they're fascinating.
But Russo, what was Russo? Was he an investigator or a?
Russo had been a friend of David Ferry's.
Okay.
David Ferry dies on February 22nd, 1967. And in the wake of Ferry's death, Garrison calls a press conference and says he was planning to arrest David Ferry the next week. And he called David Ferry one of history's most important individuals. And Perry Russo, who had known Ferry, then starts calling media outlets saying, I knew Ferry, I can talk to you about this. And he gets in the newspapers, and Garrison then sends an investigator up to Baton Rouge where Russo was living at the time. And this is on the weekend before Clay Shaw is arrested. And after a lot of massaging and hypnotizing and administration of drugs, and you should read the transcripts of these interviews. I mean, it's all leading material. He makes this identification of Clay Shaw. And that image I showed of the guy looking through the window with the camera photographing, Russo was also brought in and watched Shaw be questioned. Yeah. So, Russo will recant that testimony later, and then he will reassert that testimony later. And he has a very kind of sad end. And I think there's pretty good evidence that he was a closeted homosexual and had been arrested, was arrested on, I think, at least 2 occasions. And in the aftermath of the trial, he was a juvenile when he was picked up before that. And so he was also a vulnerable person. And I think that's a lot of what happened there.
Well, I've had a lot of, I haven't had a lot. I had some experience with truth serum. I was an anesthesiologist with on-the-job training, quote, from the Army in Vietnam. And they would take some of the Viet Cong who were captured, and they asked me to give them truth serum. And I mixed up some pentothal and everything. And, it was either they were awake or they were asleep. There was no, that in between stage. Now, I'm not an expert on it. It must work for some people, but I never found it very useful.
Yeah, I think that's the truth, is that it does work differently on different people, as any anesthesiologist would know. That's why that's such a, something that requires such care, because individuals react very differently to that group of drugs. Right. And it does not help that Russo was being questioned in a very leading way while he was being administered truth serum. Truth serum. Yeah.
And last question I have, sorry, Alicia.
No, I'm having fun. Thank you for letting me get all this out.
So Garrison lost in 1973. Was he reelected in between the time of the case, or was that the beginning of his final?
No, the trial. So the conspiracy trial ends in March 1, 1969.
Right.
But 72 hours after Clay Shaw is found not guilty, Garrison charges him with counts of perjury for testimony that he gave in his own defense. So that goes on into the early 1970s. And then Garrison is also tried, but in the immediate aftermath of the trial, he is reelected. So his 3rd term is after Clay Shaw is found not guilty. And what really, I think, sours the public on him, because he had been very, very popular among the electorate. Well, when Charles was talking this morning, it made me think he was talking about how narrowly Skiro won the mayor's office the first time. Jim Garrison got more votes than Skiro got in that election. He was the top vote getter in that entire election, the runoff, I think, or maybe not the runoff, the actual, I don't know, but he got more votes than Skiro. But then he kind of gets booted out of the district attorney's office because in 1973, he was tried twice, once on tax evasion charges and once on charges that he had been taking kickbacks from pinball operators, kind of essentially like low-level mob gambling. And he is found not guilty in both of those cases. So let's just be clear on that he is found not guilty. But I think there was so much damage done in those 2 cases that the public just kind of turned on him at that point. However, he was reelected to an appeals court seat as a judge. I want to say in 78, don't quote me on that, but he's out of government for a little while, but he finishes out his career as an elected judge in Louisiana.
Well, we may have the same thing going on in New Orleans now.
Well, I was thinking about, yeah. I was thinking about current politics. Hey,
Can I have a
Charles,
question? Yeah.
what's that?
I just wanted to ask your opinion on Jim Garrison's sexual identity. I mean, he's known as a cruiser himself. Do you think that has any play on the overall investigation or of him targeting Clay Shaw and the other guys?
Well, I mean, I think he had a pretty complicated sex life, and there's he certainly had a very active and, from the point of view of like local reformers, a pretty notorious sex life. Even though he had a wife and 5 children at home, he was, a guy on the town. And, people offer testimony about boys and or girls that Garrison had pursued. The FBI documents are full of these kinds of accusations. And for my money, it's impossible to tell at this remove what you should trust in those and what you should not. I think it's important that it's there, right? That people are like calling and talking about this to the FBI, and that the FBI is taking it seriously. Like that's what's important to me about it. But, I have no idea if he was, a closeted homosexual. Lots of, gay men then married and had children because they couldn't marry, the partners of their choice. But I honestly don't know. And, for my money, the evidence that's offered there is largely in the ether, although there is a kind of like a scene, I think it's at the Los Angeles airport, where there's an accusation that he kind of cruised another guy in a bathroom, and the airport security kind of comes in, and he writes about this later and says it's sort of FBI entrapment of him or CIA entrapment of him. But there's a small amount of documentary evidence that's hard to get around in the case, but I honestly don't know.
Yeah, we've never heard a story about a politician getting busted in a bathroom ever.
Yeah, that's like bad choice. It's like, go to the YMCA.
If there's anybody else have any other questions, then we'll probably just wrap up here. I appreciate Charles coming back on and it's kind of a beginning and ending it with Alicia. And I thank everybody for sticking around. I think we had Tamara Carboni says, can't wait to get my hands on the book. So there, you've already got one sale right there.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Thank you all for letting me kind of just talk about this. You're the first group I've had the chance to do that with. So thank Jason and thank everybody. I learned a lot at the lectures that I went to today. And so it's an honor to do this with everybody else. And good work, Jason. Everybody give Jason a hand.
I appreciate everybody doing it and taking part and sticking around all day long, and Charles always for his guidance as well. So thank you, everybody. And I will be emailing out probably on early Monday morning, the links to all of these. So thank you so much for participating.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Bye.